I've been using sea salt to make fermented hot sauce for years. And that got me thinking, if it's the sodium in sea salt that facilitates the fermentation process, sea salt isn't the only thing that has sodium in it, so what if I tried a different source of sodium? What if I tried monosodium glutamate? That could be interesting. It would certainly give the final sauce a big boost of umami. There's a thought. What if I packed in other glutamate-rich foods too to really maximize the umami, to make the ultimate umami hot sauce? Now there's an idea. Will it work? I don't know. Stay tuned while I give it a try. Let's get adventurous. So to start with, I've got some nice fresh serrano chilies, and as well as a nice moderate level of heat, chilies and peppers are a great source of glutamic acid. Next up, some cherry tomatoes. Tomatoes are also a great source of glutamates and add a lovely savoury flavour to dishes. But then we're upping the ante with some dried shiitake mushrooms. Mushrooms are really rich in savoury flavours, and dehydrating them concentrates those flavours even more. These are an absolute umami powerhouse. And then of course we've got our extra magic ingredient, MSG. So before starting this recipe, I've made a note of the weight of my fermentation jar, which is 432 grams. Then to begin, I'm putting all the shiitakes into the jar, pouring over some boiling water and leaving them to soak and rehydrate. They have a tendency to float, so I'm just giving them the occasional push back under the water. While they're soaking, I'll prepare the tomatoes. I'd like to keep these whole, but I do want the fermentation to have some access to the sugar inside them, so I'm using a skewer to poke a hole in the base of each one. And then for the chilies, I'm just giving them a rough chop. And I'm not really measuring any of these, I'm just eyeballing roughly equal quantities of each ingredient, and just enough to fill the fermentation jar. Now that the mushrooms have cooled down and rehydrated, I'm packing the rest of the ingredients into the jar and then topping that up with filtered water. And then I'm weighing the jar once more, so now I know that the jar and the contents of the jar in total add up to 1,321 grams. And then I'll tip all that water back out again, and I'll use it to make the brine. Now, I'd normally ferment this in a 3% sea salt solution, so to work out the amount of salt I need, I'll take the 1,321 grams and subtract 432 grams, which is the weight of my jar. That means the total contents of the jar, including the ingredients and water, is 889 grams. To figure out 3% of that by weight, I'll multiply by 0.03 to give me 26.7 grams of sea salt. But I'm not using sea salt. I'm using MSG, which I know from a bit of Googling only has 30% of the sodium that sea salt does. So to calculate the amount of MSG that I need to give me the same amount of sodium, I'll take that 26.7 grams and times it by 3 to get 80.1 grams. Ooh, that seems like a lot. A real lot. Oh well, let's see how we go. Wow, that looks like more than I was anticipating, but the maths checks out, so we'll see how it goes. The sodium levels should be perfect. My only concern is there might be something else in there that might inhibit the fermentation. But let's give it a try and see how it goes. Then I'm pouring the prepared brine back into the fermentation jar with the ingredients, placing a clean glass weight on top to keep everything submerged, and then securing it in place with a lid. Popping the jar into a bowl to catch any overflows, and because I'm not using any kind of airlock, I will need to loosen the lid every couple of days to release a little bit of the pressure. So I've left that in a dark place at room temperature, loosening the lid to release the pressure every day for 7 days in a row, and this is the result. It looks like a normal fermentation. The brine's gone a little bit cloudy, and there's a good amount of bubbling. As I open and have a look, there doesn't seem to be any signs of contamination, and it smells like a regular fermented hot sauce. So the fermentation seems like it's been a success. So then the next question is, how is the final sauce going to taste? It'll certainly have bags of umami, but I'm really curious to see if the different source of sodium resulted in any different fermentation characteristics. So to start moving this towards a slightly more saucy consistency, I'm pouring them into a jar to give them a blend with a stick mixer. I am pouring off a little bit of the brine, which I'm keeping aside, and I'll add that back in if it's looking a bit too thick. My goal here isn't to get a super fine puree. I'm going to put it in a saucepan and cook it on for a little bit, and that should soften everything up and help the blending process, and that should allow me to get a nice fine puree. And this was looking a bit dry, so I did end up adding all of the brine back in, and now that's all going into a saucepan to cook out. Now I always get at least one comment saying something like, why would you bother fermenting a hot sauce if you're just going to cook it out anyway? It kills all the beneficial bacteria. And yes, it does. Fermenting hot sauces develops wonderful complex flavors, and that's what I'm after, not so much the bacteria. And unless you're eating bowls and bowls of hot sauce, you're not going to be consuming enough bacteria to make a meaningful health difference anyway. If you are interested in the benefits of eating lacto fermented foods, you're much better off checking out this recipe for sauerkraut. It's super easy and super healthy. Before this goes on the stove, I'm adding 1/4 cup of apple cider vinegar for some flavour and more acidity, and 2 tablespoons of brown sugar for some sweetness, followed by a teaspoon of salt to balance things out. I'll taste it at the end and adjust any of these 3 elements to get a good final flavour balance between spicy, acidic, salty, and what I'm assuming will be heaps and heaps of umami. Now I ended up cooking this for probably 15 to 20 minutes. The dry shiitake mushrooms seemed to stay pretty firm, so I just kept cooking until they'd softened up a bit, and then I'm giving that one really good final puree before having a preliminary taste test. And the salt level is pretty good. There's tons of umami, but that's kind of overshadowing the acidity, so I'm going in with another 3 tablespoons of vinegar to help balance that back out. I'll give the sauce another taste test later in the video with some food to give you my final verdict. Then one final blend with a little bit of xanthan gum to make the final sauce glossy and nice and stable. And then, because the sauce still looks a little bit chunky from the dried mushrooms, I'm passing it through a sieve to get out any of the major lumps and leave a nice smooth sauce. And if you find you're needing an extra hand during this process, then use my signature trick of sticking the strainer handle into your belly button. Works every time. If you'd like more of my signature tricks, check out some of my other videos and hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on any new ones. So all in all, this has given me about 3.5 cups or 800 mils of sauce. And then it's just a matter of bottling, and that's my final super umami hot sauce. So now let's give it a try with some food and see what it's really like. So I've gone with something relatively neutral. Yes, I'm eating dino nuggies, don't judge me. So I'll give these a nice generous dip and see what I think. So initially it comes on a little sweet, you get a sense of the tomatoes and the chilies, there's a very slight earthiness from the mushrooms, which is quite pleasant, then the heat and acidity start to creep in, which is nice and warm but not overpowering, and then umami. Lots and lots of umami. It's got a really strong umami flavour from the main ingredients, but then that's absolutely blown out of the water by the MSG. It's quite nice, but as I expected, it's a little too much MSG. Half an hour after eating this, the inside of my mouth still kind of tasted like instant ramen. That's how long the MSG stuck on my palate. So the experiment was successful. If I did this again, I would definitely use a blend of salt and MSG, because this is just too much. I'd also note that fermenting with MSG hasn't really altered the fermentation characteristics of the sauce. I could have probably just fermented this with salt and added a little bit of MSG to taste, but I would be curious to try other sources of sodium to see what the result is there. Surely fermenting in some funky fish sauce would add some extra funky vibes to the ferment. If you'd be interested to see that, let me know in the comments and I'll keep it in mind for a future video. Check out one of these videos for some more spicy fun, and until next time, happy snacking.